Hey, hey, let me see that.
Sorry, what's going on?
That right there, put it down.
It's my cane, man. I'm
Hold
blind.
it up, let me see it. Turn it, turn it.
It's just a cane. See the tape? That's all it is.
1-6, possible 1032, white and orange object, stand by.
Copy. 1-6, what's your location?
Oak and 14th by the bus shelter.
The temperature had dropped to 35 degrees that Thursday afternoon in downtown Philadelphia. A bitter wind swept through the intersection of Market Street and 2nd Avenue, carrying with it the faint smell of exhaust and the distant rumble of traffic. The clock on the old municipal building across the street showed 4:15 p.m. Rush hour was beginning to stir. Office workers in heavy coats hurried past, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. A few pigeons scattered near the entrance of a Walgreens pharmacy, pecking at crumbs left behind by some earlier passerby. Standing near the bus stop, partially sheltered by a narrow awning that did little to block the wind, was a man named Marcus Thompson. He was 47 years old, a black man of average height with a neatly trimmed beard that had begun to show flecks of gray. He wore a navy blue winter jacket zipped up to his chin, a gray wool cap pulled low over his ears, and dark wraparound sunglasses that obscured his eyes completely. In his right hand, he held a white cane. It was a collapsible model, extended to its full length, with bright orange reflective bands wrapped around the lower sections. The cane tapped gently against the concrete as Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep warm. Marcus could not see the pigeons. He could not see the office workers, or the traffic, or the old clock tower. He could not see the cold gray sky pressing down on the city like a lid. Marcus Thompson had been completely blind for the past 13 years, ever since a scaffolding collapse at a construction site had sent metal debris into his face, severing both of his optic nerves in an instant that had changed everything about his life forever. But Marcus did not think of himself as someone defined by tragedy. He had rebuilt his life with patience and determination. After 20 months of intensive rehabilitation at a state facility for the blind, he had learned to navigate the world using his other senses. He had learned to cook, to clean, to manage his finances, to travel independently using public transportation. He had secured a job as a customer service representative for a regional health insurance company, working from a small desk in his apartment using specialized screen-reading software. He was registered with the American Foundation for the Blind and had become an active member of his local disability advocacy group. His white cane was not just a tool. It was an extension of himself, a bridge between his inner world and the physical reality around him, a symbol of the independence he had fought so hard to reclaim. Today had been a long day. Marcus had taken the bus across town for his weekly physical therapy appointment, a standing commitment he had maintained for nearly a decade. The same accident that had taken his sight had also damaged several vertebrae in his lower back. The pain was manageable most days, but it required constant attention, stretching, exercises, occasional adjustments. His physical therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Ellen Marsh, had worked with him for years. She understood his body and his limitations. The sessions always left him feeling a little sore, but also a little stronger. Now Marcus was waiting for the Route 7 bus that would take him back to his neighborhood on the west side of the city. He had made this trip dozens of times. He knew the rhythm of it. The bus usually arrived within 10 minutes of his arrival at the stop. He would board, find a seat near the front, and ride for approximately 25 minutes before the driver announced his stop. It was routine. It was ordinary. It was the kind of small, unremarkable journey that millions of people make every day without thinking twice. But this Thursday afternoon in Philadelphia was about to become something very different, something that would expose the deep fractures running through the institutions we trust to protect us, something that would force an entire city to ask uncomfortable questions about prejudice, power, and the price of willful ignorance. If you find yourself drawn into stories that explore the hidden tensions of everyday life, stories that reveal what happens when ordinary people collide with systems that fail them, then I hope you will stay with me until the end of this account. It is a story worth telling, and it is a story that demands to be heard. About 6 blocks away from where Marcus stood waiting for his bus, a patrol car idled at a red light. Behind the wheel sat Officer Derek Sullivan. He was 32 years old, with close-cropped brown hair and a jaw that seemed permanently set in an expression of vague suspicion. He had been with the Philadelphia Police Department for 6 years, the last 5 of which had been spent assigned to the downtown commercial district. His supervisors described him in official evaluations as driven and alert. Some of his colleagues used different words when speaking off the record. Words like intense, words like paranoid, words like looking for trouble. Derek Sullivan had accumulated a troubling record during his time on the force. Buried in the department's internal affairs files were 15 formal complaints filed against him by members of the public. 14 of those complaints followed a remarkably similar pattern. In each case, Officer Sullivan had stopped a black man in a commercial area of the city, detained him, and questioned him aggressively about his presence and intentions. In each case, the man stopped had been doing nothing illegal, waiting outside a bank for a friend, sitting on a bench eating lunch, standing near a jewelry store checking his phone, browsing in a bookshop window. The complaints alleged harassment, racial profiling, and in some cases, unlawful searches conducted without probable cause or consent. None of these complaints had resulted in meaningful discipline. The department's internal review process had a way of absorbing such allegations and rendering them harmless. Sullivan had received written counseling on 2 occasions. He had been required to attend a half-day workshop on community relations, but his personnel file remained clean of any suspensions, demotions, or formal reprimands. His union representative had successfully argued that each incident was isolated and that the officer had been acting within the bounds of reasonable caution. What the files did not capture, because no bureaucratic system ever truly captures such things, was the pattern of thinking that drove Derek Sullivan's behavior. It was not, strictly speaking, conscious hatred. Sullivan would have been genuinely offended if anyone had called him a racist. He had black colleagues he considered friends. He donated money every year to a youth basketball league in a predominantly black neighborhood. He believed, sincerely and without irony, that he treated everyone fairly. But something shifted in Sullivan's brain when he was on patrol. Some filter that most people carry around with them, some mechanism for seeing individuals rather than categories, seemed to switch off. When he looked at the downtown streets, he did not see citizens going about their lives. He saw threats. He saw potential crimes waiting to happen, and somehow those threats always seemed to wear the same face. His training, his instincts, his sense of self as a vigilant protector all conspired to create a lens through which certain bodies in certain places became inherently suspicious. He did not question this lens. He trusted it. And the department, by failing to hold him accountable for the 14 previous complaints, had validated that trust again and again. The radio on Sullivan's dashboard crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, reciting information with practiced efficiency. An anonymous caller had reported a suspicious male standing outside the Walgreens on Market and 2nd. The caller had described the subject as a black male wearing a dark jacket and sunglasses, possibly carrying some kind of weapon. The caller had said it looked like a pipe or a stick. The subject was just standing there, the caller had said, not moving, not going anywhere. It seemed strange. It seemed threatening. Sullivan felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. This was what he lived for. This was the moment when all his vigilance, all his careful watching, paid off. He acknowledged the dispatch and pulled away from the red light, accelerating smoothly toward the intersection 6 blocks away. His mind was already constructing scenarios, a robbery in progress, a drug deal about to go down, some kind of assault being planned. The weapon details stuck in his thoughts. A pipe or a stick. That could be anything. That could be dangerous. He did not consider even for a moment that there might be an innocent explanation. He did not wonder what kind of stick a person might legitimately carry in the middle of a city afternoon. His training had included a module on recognizing mobility aids, but it had been brief and optional, and he had paid little attention. Disability awareness was not something that occupied much space in Derek Sullivan's conception of police work. Threats were what mattered, and right now, according to the anonymous caller, there was a threat standing on the corner of Market and 2nd. Marcus Thompson heard the police car before he was aware of its significance. The sound of tires rolling to a stop, the creak of a car door opening, the heavy footsteps approaching on the concrete. These sounds registered in his mind as background noise at first, part of the general urban symphony that surrounded him every time he ventured into the city. He continued to stand quietly, his white cane held loosely in his right hand, its tip resting on the ground near his feet. He was thinking about dinner. He had leftover soup in the refrigerator. Maybe he would heat that up and listen to an audiobook before bed. The voice that shattered this peaceful reverie was loud and sharp, carrying the unmistakable edge of authority and suspicion. Quote, "Chair." Marcus turned his head toward the sound. He could not see the officer, but he could hear the tension in the man's voice. He had encountered police officers before during his years of navigating the city as a blind man. Usually these interactions were brief and professional. Sometimes an officer would offer to help him cross a street. Once, a young patrol officer had walked him to a subway entrance when he had become disoriented. Marcus had learned to approach these encounters with calm and patience. "Good afternoon, officer," Marcus said. His voice was steady and polite. "I'm waiting for the bus, the Route 7. It should be here in a few minutes." But Officer Sullivan was not listening to the words. He was looking at the object in the man's hand, a long stick, white with some kind of colored bands. It could be anything. It could be a weapon. The anonymous caller had mentioned a stick. Here was a stick. The man was wearing sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. He was standing still in a commercial area. All of Sullivan's instincts screamed that something was wrong. "What is that in your hand?" Sullivan demanded. He had positioned himself about 8 feet away from Marcus, his right hand resting on his belt near his service weapon. His body was tense, coiled, ready to react to any sudden movement. "Put it down, now." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He recognized the tone. It was the tone of confrontation, of assumed guilt. He had heard about encounters like this. He had friends in the disability community who had shared their own stories of being stopped, questioned, treated with suspicion simply for existing in public space while blind. He had always hoped it would not happen to him. "Officer, this is my cane," Marcus said carefully. He lifted it slightly, angling it so that the white surface and reflective bands would be visible. "I'm blind. This is a mobility aid. It's how I navigate. I can't put it down." There is a moment in encounters like this, a fulcrum point where everything hangs in the balance. A reasonable officer receiving this information would step back and reassess. A reasonable officer would recognize the white cane for what it was, a universally understood symbol of visual impairment. A reasonable officer would apologize for the confusion, perhaps offer assistance, and move on. Derek Sullivan was not that officer. Something in his mind had already locked into a threat assessment that refused to yield to new information. The man was being uncooperative. The man was refusing to drop the object. These facts, filtered through Sullivan's rigid categories, overrode everything else. Quote 7. Sullivan's voice rose to a near shout. "I'm not going to ask again. Drop the weapon and put your hands where I can see them." Marcus felt his heart rate accelerating. He was standing on a public sidewalk in the middle of the afternoon, surrounded by other pedestrians, being ordered to surrender his only means of independent movement by a police officer who apparently could not or would not recognize the most basic symbol of blindness. The situation was absurd. It was terrifying. It was exactly the kind of encounter that the Americans with Disabilities Act was supposed to prevent. "Officer, please listen to me." Marcus worked to keep his voice calm even as fear tightened his chest. "I am a blind person. I have been blind for 13 years. This white cane is a federally protected mobility device. I have every right to carry it, and I am not required to put it down. I am asking you to recognize what this is and to treat me with the respect that the law requires." But Sullivan was no longer processing language in any meaningful way. His radio was in his hand, and he was speaking into it rapidly. "This is Unit 47 requesting immediate backup at Market and 2nd. I have a male subject refusing to comply with commands. Subject is in possession of an unknown object, possibly a weapon, requesting additional units." Let me pause here to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right, but the person in authority simply refused to listen? Have you ever felt the helplessness of trying to explain something obvious to someone who has already made up their mind? I think many of us have had moments like that, moments that feel small but carry a weight of injustice. Now imagine that moment happening while you are blind, while you are standing alone on a cold street corner, while a police officer with a gun is treating your disability as a crime. Take a moment to consider what that must feel like. And if this story resonates with you, I hope you will leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. The backup arrived in less than 4 minutes. A second patrol car pulled up to the curb, and Officer Linda Castillo stepped out. She was 42 years old, a veteran of 18 years on the force with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and a face that had seen enough of the world to recognize patterns both hopeful and tragic. Unlike Sullivan, Castillo had attended every optional training module the department offered, including a comprehensive 8-hour workshop on disability awareness and accommodation that had been introduced 3 years earlier. She had taken that training seriously. As she approached the scene, taking in the tableau before her, her experienced eyes registered details that Sullivan had apparently missed entirely. The man standing near the bus stop was holding a white cane with reflective orange bands. He was wearing dark sunglasses that wrapped around his face, the kind often worn by people with severe photosensitivity or total vision loss. His posture was not aggressive, it was defensive. He was standing very still, as if any sudden movement might provoke an escalation. Castillo felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. She had seen too many encounters like this. Officers who jumped to conclusions, officers who let fear and prejudice override training and common sense. She had filed reports about such encounters before, knowing they would disappear into the bureaucratic void, but she had never been able to simply look away. "Sullivan," she called out, keeping her voice calm and authoritative. "Stand down. Lower your hand." Sullivan turned to look at her, confusion and annoyance flickering across his face. "I've got a non-compliant subject here, Castillo. He's refusing to drop a potential weapon. I need you to cover me while I approach." Castillo shook her head slowly. She walked past Sullivan, her hands visible and open, her body language deliberately non-threatening. She stopped about 6 feet from Marcus Thompson and spoke in a voice designed to de-escalate. "Sir, my name is Officer Linda Castillo. I can see that you're holding a white cane. I understand that you are blind. There is no threat here. This situation is going to be resolved safely and respectfully. I apologize for any distress you've experienced." Marcus let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. His shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, began to relax slightly. "Thank you, officer. I've been trying to explain that for several minutes." Sullivan stepped forward, his face reddening. "Castillo, what are you doing? This man has been refusing my commands. I was told he had a weapon. We need to secure the scene." "What you were told," Castillo replied, her voice hardening, "was apparently a misunderstanding. What you are looking at is a mobility aid used by blind individuals. It is not a weapon. It has never been a weapon. Any officer with basic training should recognize it immediately. This man has done nothing wrong, and this encounter is over." But Sullivan was not ready to concede. His mind was still churning through its threat assessments, still looking for justification for his actions. "We have an anonymous report. He was behaving suspiciously, standing in one place, not moving. I had reasonable suspicion to investigate." "You had nothing," Castillo said. "Waiting for a bus is not suspicious behavior. Being blind is not suspicious behavior. You have just harassed a member of the public who is exercising his legal rights, and I am going to make sure this is documented." As if summoned by the tension, a third vehicle arrived at the scene. It was an unmarked car, and the man who emerged from it wore the insignia of a sergeant. His name was Paul Hendricks. He was 54 years old, with 26 years on the force, and he had the weary look of someone who had spent too many hours cleaning up messes made by other people. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance: the rigid posture of Sullivan, the calm stance of Castillo, the blind man still holding his cane near the bus stop. He had been monitoring the radio traffic and had decided to respond personally. "Sullivan, Castillo, report." Castillo spoke first. Sergeant Officer Sullivan responded to an anonymous tip about a suspicious male with a possible weapon. The subject is a blind man named Marcus Thompson. He was waiting for a bus. His white cane was mistaken for a weapon. I arrived and de-escalated the situation. There is no crime here. There has been no crime. Hendricks turned to Sullivan. "Is that accurate?" Sullivan hesitated. For the first time, something like doubt flickered across his face. He looked at the cane in Marcus's hand. Really looked at it, and the reality of the situation began to penetrate the fog of his preconceptions, but he was not ready to admit error. His pride, his sense of himself as a competent officer, resisted the obvious conclusion. "One's quote 26, he said defensively. "Quote 27. Quote 28. Hendricks replied, "Quote 29. The sergeant took a step toward Marcus. His voice softened. "Quote 30. Marcus shook his head slowly. The adrenaline was still coursing through his system, but the immediate danger had passed. Quote 31, he said. Quote 32, quote 33, Hendricks replied. Quote 34. Sullivan stood frozen for a moment, disbelief written across his features. In 6 years on the force, he had never faced real consequences for any of his actions. The complaints had come and gone, absorbed by a system designed to protect its own. But something was different this time, something in the sergeant's tone, in the presence of Castillo as a witness, in the sheer absurdity of the encounter itself, had broken through the usual defenses. Without a word, Sullivan walked back to his patrol car, got in, and drove away. His career, though he did not yet fully realize it, had just ended. Marcus Thompson's bus arrived 12 minutes after the officers dispersed. Officer Castillo waited with him, making small talk about the weather and the difficulty of navigating public transportation in a city that had been designed without accessibility in mind. When the Route 7 bus pulled up to the curb, she helped him board and find a seat near the front. Then she stood on the sidewalk and watched the bus pull away, carrying with it a man whose ordinary Thursday afternoon had just become something extraordinary. That evening, Marcus Thompson sat in his small apartment on the west side of Philadelphia and tried to process what had happened. The soup sat untouched in its pot on the stove. The audiobook he had planned to listen to remained unplayed. Instead, he sat in his favorite chair, the one position near the window where he could feel the fading warmth of sunlight, even though he could not see it. And he replayed the encounter in his mind again and again. The fear he had felt, the helplessness, the absurdity of being treated as a threat because of the very tool that allowed him to live independently. He thought about all the years he had spent rebuilding his life after the accident. All the therapy, the training, the determination to prove that blindness did not have to mean dependence. And in a matter of minutes, one officer's prejudice had nearly undone all of that. But Marcus Thompson was not a man who surrendered to despair. He had survived the loss of his sight. He had survived the pain and the grief and the long, hard work of learning to navigate a world that had suddenly gone dark. He had emerged from that crucible with a clear understanding of his own value and his own rights. And he was not about to let Derek Sullivan or anyone else take that away from him. He picked up his phone and called his sister. Then he called a friend who worked at a disability advocacy organization. Then he called a civil rights attorney whose name he had been given years ago and had kept in his contacts just in case. By the end of the evening, the machinery of accountability had begun to turn. The case that followed would take 16 months to resolve, but its eventual conclusion would stand as one of the largest disability discrimination settlements in Pennsylvania history. Let us take a moment to look more closely at what the legal process revealed, because it exposes patterns that extend far beyond any single officer or any single encounter. The lawsuit filed on behalf of Marcus Thompson named the city of Philadelphia, the police department, and Derek Sullivan personally as defendants. It alleged violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, and several constitutional provisions relating to unlawful detention and equal protection under the law. It claimed that Sullivan had engaged in deliberate discrimination against a person with a disability, that he had failed to provide reasonable accommodation, that he had detained Marcus without probable cause or reasonable suspicion, and that the department had been deliberately indifferent to Sullivan's pattern of misconduct. The discovery process unearthed documents that the department would have preferred to keep buried. Internal memos showed that Sullivan had been flagged during his probationary period for concerns about aggressive tactics and potential racial bias. His training officer had noted that he seemed to have difficulty distinguishing between legitimate threats and innocent civilians. But the department had been facing a severe staffing shortage at the time, and Sullivan had been approved for full duty despite these concerns. The memo concluding his probation had used the word hypervigilant as if this were a positive quality rather than a warning sign. The 15 previous complaints filed against Sullivan were introduced as evidence of a pattern. The attorneys representing Marcus argued that any reasonable supervisor reviewing this history would have recognized that Sullivan posed a risk to the public. They argued that the department's failure to take meaningful action constituted deliberate indifference, a legal standard that carries significant weight in civil rights cases. The body camera footage from the encounter became the centerpiece of the legal proceedings. It showed Sullivan approaching Marcus with his hand on his weapon. It showed Marcus calmly explaining that he was blind and that the object in his hand was a cane. It showed Sullivan ignoring these explanations in escalating the encounter by calling for backup and describing Marcus as non-compliant. It showed Officer Castillo arriving and immediately recognizing what Sullivan had refused to see. The footage was unambiguous. It left no room for the kinds of alternative explanations that defendants in such cases often construct. Faced with this evidence, the city's legal team made the calculation that defendants in such cases often make. A trial would be public. The footage would be played in open court. The pattern of complaints would be examined in detail. The department's failures would be exposed for all to see. The risk of an even larger verdict, combined with the certainty of damaging publicity, made settlement the rational choice. The final settlement was $1.2 million. It was not the largest such settlement in the country, but it was substantial enough to send a message. More importantly, the settlement included provisions requiring the department to implement specific reforms in its training and oversight procedures. These were not mere promises. They were binding commitments subject to court supervision. But for Marcus Thompson, the settlement was never primarily about the money. When asked about it during a later interview, he spoke with a quiet intensity that conveyed years of frustration finally finding expression. "That officer did not make an honest mistake," Marcus said. "I told him clearly that I was blind. I showed him my cane. I invoked my legal protections. He chose to ignore all of it because he had already decided what he was looking at. He saw a black man standing on a corner, and that was enough for him. The cane was invisible to him because it did not fit his assumptions. That is not a training problem. That is a character problem, and the department allowed it to happen by ignoring 15 complaints that should have ended his career years ago." Derek Sullivan was formally terminated 8 weeks after the encounter. The termination was upheld through the internal appeals process after the union reviewed the body camera footage and determined that no reasonable defense could be mounted. His name was entered into the state's decertification database, a registry that prevents terminated officers from being hired by other law enforcement agencies. His career as a police officer was permanently over. I want to pause here and ask you to consider something. Derek Sullivan was not a cartoon villain. He did not wake up that Thursday morning planning to harass a blind man. He probably believed, right up until the moment the sergeant placed him on leave, that he was doing his job correctly, that he was protecting the public, that his instincts were sound. And that is precisely what makes this story so troubling. The harm caused by officers like Sullivan is not the result of exceptional malice. It is the result of ordinary biases operating within a system that fails to check them. It is the result of training that emphasizes threats over understanding. It is the result of a culture that rewards vigilance without demanding wisdom. How do we fix something that is so deeply woven into the fabric of an institution? How do we teach people to see what they have trained themselves to overlook? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we must continue to ask. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The reforms mandated by the settlement agreement took effect 13 months after the encounter on Market Street. They represented the most comprehensive overhaul of disability-related training in the Philadelphia Police Department's history. First, the department established a mandatory disability awareness curriculum that all officers were required to complete before being authorized for solo patrol duty. The training covered the recognition of common mobility and sensory aids, the legal requirements of the ADA, and the psychological dynamics of encounters with individuals who have disabilities. It was not a brief checkbox exercise. It was a multi-day program that included role-playing scenarios, testimony from disabled community members, and assessments to verify comprehension. Second, the department implemented an automatic review protocol triggered by patterns in complaint data. Under the new system, any officer who accumulated 3 or more similar complaints within a 24-month period would be subject to mandatory supervisory review, psychological evaluation, and potential reassignment. The goal was to identify problematic patterns before they resulted in serious harm. Third, the department established a real-time body camera monitoring program for encounters involving disability accommodation requests. Supervisors would be alerted whenever an officer's camera recorded language suggesting a disability-related issue, allowing for immediate intervention if necessary. Fourth, the department formalized partnerships with several disability rights organizations in the region. Representatives from these organizations would participate in training programs, review complaint data, and provide ongoing feedback on departmental practices. Fifth, the field training period for new officers was extended, with enhanced evaluation criteria that specifically assessed their ability to de-escalate encounters and recognize protected populations. These reforms were announced at a press conference that drew significant media attention. The chief of police stood at a podium flanked by representatives from disability advocacy groups and community organizations. She acknowledged that the department had failed Marcus Thompson and expressed a commitment to ensuring that such failures would not be repeated. But Marcus himself, watching the press conference from his apartment through an audio description provided by a friend, felt something complicated: satisfaction that changes were being made, frustration that it had taken his own suffering to prompt those changes, skepticism about whether the reforms would survive the inevitable pressures of budget constraints, political shifts, and institutional resistance, hope, fragile but persistent, that somewhere in the city, a young officer was watching the same press conference and beginning to understand something important about the nature of their responsibility. The story of what happened on the corner of Market and 2nd Avenue spread far beyond Philadelphia in the weeks following the settlement announcement. National disability rights organizations cited it as evidence of the urgent need for federal legislation mandating comprehensive disability training for all law enforcement officers. Op-eds appeared in major newspapers questioning why it had taken a $1 million lawsuit to teach a police department to recognize a white cane. Social media channels dedicated to disability advocacy shared Marcus's story thousands of times, each share carrying with it a message about the everyday indignities faced by people with disabilities in public spaces. And in police departments across the country, training officers quietly pulled out their curricula and began reviewing their disability awareness modules. Some found those modules adequate, others found them woefully insufficient. A few found that they had no such modules at all. The case of Marcus Thompson had become a reference point, a cautionary tale, an example of what could happen when institutions failed to see the people they were supposed to serve. For Marcus himself, the aftermath of the case brought changes both welcome and unwelcome. The settlement money provided financial security he had never known, allowing him to pay off debts accumulated during the long legal process and to make improvements to his apartment that enhanced his independence. He became a spokesperson for disability rights, speaking at conferences and community meetings about his experience and the changes it had prompted. He found purpose in this work, a sense that his suffering had not been meaningless. But there were difficult moments too. Nightmares that visited him in the early hours of the morning, replaying the sound of Sullivan's voice demanding that he drop his cane. A new vigilance on street corners, an awareness that any passing patrol car might contain another officer who saw threats where none existed. The knowledge that the reforms mandated by the settlement agreement might not prevent the next Marcus Thompson from facing the same ordeal. On the 1-year anniversary of the encounter, Marcus took the bus to the corner of Market and 2nd Avenue. He stood in approximately the same spot where he had stood that Thursday afternoon, his white cane in his hand, the winter wind cutting through his jacket. He could not see the traffic or the pedestrians or the Walgreens entrance, but he could feel the presence of the city around him, the great churning engine of humanity that carried on regardless of individual stories of injustice and redemption. He thought about Derek Sullivan. He wondered where the former officer was now, whether he had found other work, whether he had ever come to understand what he had done wrong. Marcus did not hate Sullivan exactly. Hatred required more energy than Marcus was willing to spend, but he did not forgive him either. Forgiveness, in Marcus's view, required acknowledgement and change, and he had seen no evidence that Sullivan had offered either. Mostly, Marcus thought about the future, about all the blind people navigating cities across the country, about all the people with disabilities who moved through public space knowing that at any moment they might be misunderstood, confronted, treated as threats simply for existing, about the officers who would encounter them and the choices those officers would make, about the systems and the training and the cultures that would shape those choices. The Route 7 bus arrived on schedule. Marcus boarded, found his usual seat near the front, and rode home through the darkening afternoon. His cane rested across his knees, its white surface and orange reflective bands visible to anyone who cared to look. As we approach the end of this account, I want to return to some of the questions that have threaded through the narrative, because this is not just a story about one man and one officer. It is a story about the systems we build and the assumptions we carry, and the consequences that follow when those systems and assumptions collide with human beings who do not fit neatly into expected categories. Derek Sullivan had 15 complaints filed against him before he stopped Marcus Thompson on that cold Thursday afternoon. 15 opportunities for intervention, 15 chances for supervisors to recognize a pattern and take action. Each of those complaints represented another human being who had been subjected to Sullivan's aggressive suspicion. Most of them were black men, stopped without cause in commercial areas of the city, their presence treated as inherently threatening. Each of them had filed paperwork, answered questions, and waited for something to happen, and each time, nothing meaningful had happened. The system had absorbed their complaints like a sponge absorbs water without being changed by them. Why did this happen? The answers are complex and uncomfortable. Staffing shortages that led the department to overlook red flags during probationary evaluations. Union agreements that made termination difficult, even in cases with clear patterns of misconduct. Supervisors who were overworked, underpaid, and incentivized to keep things running smoothly rather than to rock the boat. A culture that valued loyalty over accountability and that treated civilian complaints with reflexive skepticism. A criminal justice system that structurally empowered officers while leaving those they stopped with limited recourse. None of these factors excuse what Sullivan did. He was an individual who made choices, and those choices caused harm. But the factors help explain why Sullivan was able to make those choices again and again without facing consequences. They help explain why Marcus Thompson was not the first person to be harassed by this officer, and why, absent the particular circumstances of this case, he might not have been the last. The reforms implemented after the settlement were meaningful and important. They addressed specific gaps in training and oversight that had contributed to the encounter. They created mechanisms for identifying and addressing patterns of misconduct. They established partnerships that could help the department learn from the communities it served. These were not empty gestures. They were real changes that had the potential to prevent real harm. But reforms are only as durable as the commitment to enforce them. They require ongoing funding, ongoing attention, ongoing political will. They require leaders who prioritize accountability over convenience and who are willing to face resistance from within their own institutions. They require officers who internalize the values behind the policies, not just the letter of the regulations. And they require a public that continues to pay attention even after the headlines fade, that refuses to accept stories like Marcus Thompson's as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of deeper problems. That demands transparency and accountability, not just in moments of crisis, but as an ongoing condition of public service. This brings me to a final question for you, and I hope you will take a moment to consider it seriously. What is the proper role of consequences in shaping institutional behavior? When an officer like Derek Sullivan is terminated and decertified, it sends a message to other officers about what will not be tolerated. But it also ends one person's career, and that ending has its own human dimension. When a department pays a settlement of $1.2 million, it transfers resources from public coffers that might otherwise fund schools or hospitals or parks. These consequences have costs, and yet without them there is no pressure for change. I do not have a simple answer to this question, and I am suspicious of anyone who claims to. What I know is that accountability matters, that without consequences, there is no deterrent, that institutions, like individuals, respond to incentives, and that the 15 people who filed complaints against Derek Sullivan before Marcus Thompson deserved a system that listened to them sooner. If you have stayed with me through this entire account, I want to thank you. Stories like this are not easy to tell or to hear. They ask us to sit with discomfort, to confront realities that we might prefer to ignore, to hold in our minds the complexity of systems that often seem designed to resist improvement. But I believe that telling these stories matters. That by bearing witness to what happened on the corner of Market and 2nd Avenue, we participate in a form of accountability that extends beyond any courtroom or settlement agreement. We add our attention to the weight that presses for change. And so I will leave you with this. Somewhere in Philadelphia today, there is a blind person walking down a street, their white cane tapping against the pavement, their dark glasses shielding eyes that cannot see. They are navigating a world that was not built for them, relying on tools and skills that most sighted people never have to think about. They are going to work, or to the doctor, or to visit a friend, or simply to the corner store for a carton of milk. They are living their life. And somewhere in that same city, a patrol car is moving through the streets. An officer is behind the wheel, watching the sidewalks, scanning for threats, making the 1,000 small judgments that police work requires. That officer has been through training that did not exist a few years ago. That officer has been told about the encounter between Derek Sullivan and Marcus Thompson. That officer carries body camera footage as a constant record of their choices. What happens when these two paths cross? What will that officer see when they look at the person with the cane? Will they see a threat, a weapon, a suspicious individual engaged in suspicious behavior? Or will they see a human being navigating the world as best they can, deserving of the same respect and protection afforded to anyone else? I do not know the answer, but I know that the answer matters. And I know that stories like the one I have told you today are one small way of tilting the odds toward justice. If you found this story meaningful, I ask you to share it with someone who should hear it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more accounts like this one, stories that illuminate the hidden dynamics of power and prejudice in everyday life. And leave a comment telling me what you think. Should there be federal legislation requiring disability awareness training for all police officers? Should officers face automatic suspension after a certain number of similar complaints? What would you have done if you had been Officer Castillo arriving at a scene where a colleague was about to make a terrible mistake? These questions do not have easy answers, but asking them is how we begin to find our way forward. The corner of Market and 2nd Avenue looks the same today as it did on that cold Thursday afternoon. The Walgreens is still there. The bus stop still serves the Route 7 line. Pedestrians still hurry past on their way to wherever they are going, bundled against the cold, absorbed in their own thoughts, taking for granted the 1,000 small freedoms that define ordinary life. But something did change, even if you cannot see it from the street. Somewhere in the filing cabinets of the Philadelphia Police Department, there are new protocols and new training requirements and new mechanisms for accountability. Somewhere in the records of the State Law Enforcement Board, there is a name that can no longer wear a badge. Somewhere in the collective memory of a city, there is a story that will not be forgotten, a reminder that assumptions carry consequences, and that vigilance without wisdom is just another form of blindness. Marcus Thompson still lives in his apartment on the west side of the city. He still takes the bus to his physical therapy appointments every week. He still works his job, answering calls, helping people navigate the complexities of their insurance coverage. He still walks with his white cane extended before him, its tip sweeping back and forth across the pavement, its white surface in orange, reflective bands visible to anyone who cares to look. He has not forgotten what happened. He never will. But he has also refused to let it define him. The encounter with Derek Sullivan was a violation, a moment of profound injustice that revealed fractures running through the institutions we depend on. But it was also, in a strange way, an opportunity to force change, an opportunity to bear witness, an opportunity to remind a city and a nation that people with disabilities are not threats to be assessed, but citizens to be served. And that is where we end. Not with a tidy resolution that ties up every loose end, because real life does not work that way, but with the recognition that progress is possible, that accountability matters, and that the stories we tell have the power to shape the world we share. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one.